Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev was born on March 2nd, 1931 in Privolnoy, a small village in the North Caucasus. He was born into a hard world ravaged by a man-made famine which claimed the lives of several of his family members and killed almost half of his village. Stalin's Great Terror came in the following years, which saw both of his grandfathers sent to the gulags. Then, on June 22, 1941, his country was invaded by the Nazis. By 1942, his village was terrorized by invaders and Red Army deserters alike. The meager harvest that year was soon seized by the state, leaving them with nothing. A more awful childhood is difficult to imagine, but Gorbachev survived it, and he learned from it. As a teenager, he worked 20-hour days alongside his father in the summers, cultivating impressive harvests. For this work, and for his performance in school, he was admitted to the law school of Moscow State University and made the 1,000-mile journey to the empire's capital. Here's where two crucial developments occurred for Gorbachev. First, he began to foster his own ideology, with harrowing memories of his childhood feeding real doubts about the merits of Stalinism. Second, he met Raisa Titarenko, the woman who would become his wife. Raisa would prove to be his most trusted advisor and his only permanent ally. They married in 1953, the same year Stalin died, and slowly, things began to change. In 1955, after his graduation, the Gorbachevs moved to Stavropol, a city near his birthplace. He embodied the new era of anti-Stalinist communism and rose quickly through the ranks, becoming the first secretary of the Stavropol region by 1970. Within a decade, he was on the Central Committee and a member of the Politburo, an astronomical rise that made him a relatively spry 50-year-old in the company of the geriatric Bolsheviks who had been asleep at the wheel of a global superpower for a decade. General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev was already in severe mental and physical decline by 1980, and when he died 2 years later, Yuri Andropov was selected to succeed him. Andropov was a KGB man who recognized Gorbachev's potential, and with his health already failing within a year, he prepped Gorbachev to step into the big chair. He died in 1984, having ruled only 15 months. But instead of nominating Gorbachev, the Politburo selected the terminally ill Konstantin Chernenko as the new general secretary. They rightly believed that the aging party bureaucrat would be easier to control than Gorbachev. Chernenko was often too ill to attend party meetings, leaving Gorbachev to chair the sessions in his stead. And when he died after only 13 months, Mikhail Gorbachev was finally selected as the new general secretary. What nobody then suspected was that he would be the Soviet Union's final leader. Gorbachev's ascension in 1985 was a cause for real excitement and optimism for many of the 265 million Soviet citizens. He was their youngest leader since Stalin, and after decades of stagnation, he represented the possibility of real change. Western leaders saw him as a strong adversary, but also someone rational who could be reasoned with. He acknowledged the poor living conditions and failing economy that plagued the Soviet people, and he introduced two revolutionary changes in policy: Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost meant transparency, a promise of free speech to the people, a reduction in censorship, and the permissibility of criticism of leadership. Perestroika meant restructuring, and it was a frank acknowledgement of the disastrously stagnant state of the Soviet economy. It meant introducing substantial reforms to improve socialism and the lives of the people. These two principles would define his era, but he couldn't implement them alone. He needed to elevate a new crop of liberal, reform-minded economists, foreign policy advisors, and legalists to fill in the Soviet bureaucracy, including one relatively unknown man from the Urals named Boris Yeltsin, who Gorbachev chose as the party secretary of Moscow. Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin was born 1 month before Gorbachev in February of 1931 in Budka, a village in the Urals. He lived through the same horrific conditions of famine, despotism, and war as Gorbachev. His grandfather was a victim of Stalin's purges, his father was arrested for anti-Soviet agitation, and he and his mother were ejected from their home. But they survived, and in time, life improved. Like Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin excelled academically and socially in school. He was also an athlete. While they were both born to villages in distant provinces of the USSR, the differences between the two men were evident at a young age. While Gorbachev was well-read and interested in humanities, Yeltsin was a troublemaker. As a teenager, he even blew off much of his left hand while fiddling with a stolen grenade. He attended the Ural Polytechnic Institute where he met Naina Yosifovna, the woman he would marry, and he emerged as an engineer in 1955. He soared through the ranks in the construction industry in Sverdlovsk, disciplining a drunken and disordered workforce into an effective unit. He was steady, punctual, and effective, and eventually rose to first secretary of the Regional Party Committee in 1976 at the uncommonly young age of 45. Yeltsin was remarkably frank with the people, even showing a willingness to criticize the party in the secretive Brezhnev era. Populist support protected him, as it would for much of the next 15 years. When Gorbachev took power in 1985, he looked around for reform-minded bureaucrats to fill in his top brass. Yeltsin, an uncommonly motivated and strong character in a sluggish era of Soviet communism, was brought to Moscow and made first secretary of the Moscow Communist Party. Unwittingly, Gorbachev had just created the man who would one day bury him, but all that comes later. In '85, nobody was thinking about the end of the Soviet Union yet, but there was an undeniable air of anxiety about the future. Glasnost made it possible to publicly acknowledge problems, and perestroika was supposed to give a path to solving them, but nobody had a clear vision for how to fix such pervasive and disastrous issues. Machines broke down and nobody knew how to fix them. Trains arrived at the station with no one to unload them. Food rotted. Stores were empty. The system offered little incentive to productivity. Alcoholism was as rampant as crime, and nobody believed things were going to get any better. The disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1986 demonstrated fundamental flaws in all sectors of the Soviet Union. The Soviet economy, which had been competitive with the United States 30 years earlier, was now spiraling out of control. Gorbachev wanted to make changes, but even if he knew how, his efforts were blocked by reactionary forces inside the Politburo, and it took 2 years for him to solidify enough control to finally eject the majority of the Brezhnev-era conservatives from power and bring in his own people. To briefly explain the disaster in the Soviet economy, I'll borrow from economic historian Chris Miller. Gorbachev and other reform-minded Soviets looked to the success of Deng Xiaoping's reforms in China for inspiration, and they saw a communist state relaxing its controls over the economy and making market reforms like decollectivizing farms and incentivizing productivity via profits. Gorbachev wanted to introduce similar reforms, but unlike in China, he faced serious resistance from reactionaries and interest groups, so he has to cut extremely expensive and ineffective deals to push reforms through. To reform the industrial sector, he has to give ineffective investments to industrial interest groups. To reform agriculture, he has to pay world record subsidies to the agricultural industry. All this balloons the budget deficit, and when a state faces a growing deficit, it has three options. First, it can cut spending. Second, it can raise taxes. Third, it can issue debt. Gorbachev thought the first was impossible because powerful interest groups would depose him if he tried. He felt the second was impossible because it would cause mass unrest that would empower the reactionary neo-Stalinist forces in the party. This left only the third. At first, he borrowed money from Western banks, but eventually they refused to lend any more money to the Soviets, so he started printing massive amounts of money to fund the payoffs he needed to push through his reforms. In capitalist countries, this would drive inflation, but in a command economy, the prices are locked in by the state. So instead, you get vendors selling their goods on the black market for 10 or 20 times what they'd get on the legal market, and the state's tax income from legal sales plummets, and the budget deficit increases, driving more money printing and more inflation on the black market. The more Gorbachev tried to push for the reforms that could have saved the Soviet economy, the worse things got. It's also worth noting that the USSR was a major oil exporter, and the 1980s saw oil prices plummet, which dropped state income even lower. One of the few factors Gorbachev had in his favor was ending the extremely expensive and unsuccessful war in Afghanistan, but by then it had already taken a massive toll on both the Soviet economy and global perception of Soviet power. Things were bad at the center of the Union, but they were often worse at the periphery. States that had been forcibly annexed into the USSR decades earlier had long lived under the threat of Soviet tyranny, and with the advent of glasnost, two new factors emerged. First, people could openly talk about the tragedies and atrocities committed against them during the 20th century, and second, they could finally openly speak about seceding from the Union. Foremost among these were the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, who had been annexed into the USSR by a secret deal between Hitler and Stalin in 1939, But many others chafed for independence too. Ukraine and Belarusia to the west, and Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan in the south experienced growing tensions between themselves, each other, and Moscow that threatened to split the Soviet Union apart at the seams. Increasingly, Gorbachev was forced to choose between allowing these republics to peacefully drift away from the center or compelling them to stay by force. Gorbachev was at the center of a tug-of-war between reactionaries and reformers at the helm of an empire in deep crisis. He wanted to make a gentle transition from hardline communism to humanitarian socialism and democracy, walking a middle road between conservatives who wanted him to maintain the state through authoritarianism and radical democratic reformers who felt that fundamental change couldn't wait any longer. Two characters embodied this duality. On his right, his second secretary Yegor Ligachev, an ally who pivoted to hardline anti-reform. And on his left, Boris Yeltsin, the party secretary of Moscow who cultivated popular support to push for rapid change. For a time, Gorbachev benefited from this situation, with allies pulling him in both directions to keep him moving down the middle path. The two men couldn't stand each other, and in 1987, Yeltsin even tendered his resignation from the Politburo, which no one had ever done before, because of his untenable friction with Ligachev. But Gorbachev ultimately talked him into staying. Ironically, when Gorbachev had doubts about bringing Yeltsin to Moscow back in 1985, it was Ligachev who convinced him that Yeltsin was the right man for the job, a decision he'd quickly come to regret. For a time, the situation worked in Gorbachev's favor. Yeltsin always saw Gorbachev as patronizing, and Gorbachev thought Yeltsin was egotistical and prone to drunkenness, but Yeltsin's gravity pulling Gorbachev to the left allowed them to make real inroads towards liberalization. Tragically, the alliance wouldn't last. At a Central Committee meeting on October 21, 1987, the balance broke. It was a mundane party meeting, but as it was closing, Yeltsin walked up and took the stage. He began speaking about how Ligachev was an obstacle in the way of progress, then accused the party of generating a cult of personality around Gorbachev. He argued that all the talk of perestroika was just words, that none of their actions were actually reaching the people, and that Gorbachev was inconsistent and susceptible to pressure from the right wing. Fair charges, given that Gorbachev always moved slowly to avoid a potential reactionary countersurge. Even in the era of glasnost, Yeltsin's remarks were an unprecedentedly candid criticism of the party secretary. Gorbachev responded calmly, appearing to take the remarks seriously. Then he opened the floor for speakers. What happened next would permanently ruin the relationship between the two men. 25 members of the Congress rose to speak, one after another, speaking for 5 straight hours, launching scathing criticisms of Yeltsin for disloyalty, egotism, self-promotion, and stupidity. Gorbachev could have stopped them at any time, but he didn't. Yeltsin sat silently for hours as leaders of the party took turns ruthlessly slandering him. The meeting finally concluded with a unanimous censure of Yeltsin that even he voted for. 3 weeks later, before the Central Committee reconvened, Gorbachev was convinced to reach out to Yeltsin and try to preserve him as a reformist ally. That day, however, Yeltsin was found in his office, covered in blood. He'd slashed himself badly with scissors, more likely an act of wild frustration than suicide, and was hospitalized. The very next day, heavily medicated and hardly able to stand, Gorbachev summoned him to the Moscow Party Committee meeting. Gorbachev spoke first, saying that glasnost allowed for healthy dissent, but that Yeltsin was politically immature and conceited for criticizing perestroika. Again, speakers came to the stage and spent hours tearing Yeltsin to shreds. Glasnost was supposed to protect criticism of leadership, and Yeltsin wasn't jailed or deported for his words, but acts of political retribution like this are hardly the hallmark of a free and open society. At the end, half-conscious, Yeltsin was allowed to come to the stage, needing Gorbachev to physically support him. He was completely abject before Gorbachev, confessing to his personal ambition and showering praise on the first secretary. The meeting ended with Yeltsin stripped of his position as Moscow Party secretary, but rather than politically destroying him, Gorbachev allowed him to stay on in an administrative position. Privately, though, he promised Yeltsin that he would never allow him back into high-level politics. The repercussions of this episode, known as the Yeltsin File, were long-lasting. The party meetings were supposed to be kept secret, but nothing like this stayed secret for very long. Western leaders in Europe and America heard about it, and they started seeing Gorbachev in a new light. They believed in him as someone who could bring real change, but this act of retribution reeked of Bolshevism. He did remain popular in the West, but everybody remembered what happened to those who crossed him. Yeltsin himself became something of a martyr. He was already popular among the people for his frankness, strength, and relatability. Now he'd stood up for them against the Soviet leadership. What he'd said was basically true. Perestroika was moving slowly, and the lives of the average people weren't really improved much by it. Much of the public felt that he was torn to shreds because he went to bat for them, and they didn't forget it. Most importantly, it was a blunder by Gorbachev because he didn't understand the risk of humiliating a strong opponent like Yeltsin without completely destroying him. He could have easily fired him outright or made him an ambassador to some remote country, but he didn't. The two men by now hated each other, both as men and as politicians, so why did Gorbachev keep Yeltsin around? No one exactly knows, but for all that he'd revealed about himself in the affair, Gorbachev was still a man inclined towards democracy and humanitarianism. Maybe that was why Yeltsin got to stay, or maybe not. Years later, Gorbachev described two regrets about the affair. First, letting the retribution against Yeltsin go so far, and second, letting Yeltsin remain in the picture after everything had gone so sour. Gorbachev went into the closing years of the 1980s with countless problems. After the Yeltsin affair, the right wing was empowered and the left wing was inflamed. The republics chafed for change and the economy sank deeper and deeper into the mud. Nothing was working.
съезд КПСС собрался на крутом переломе жизни страны, современного мира в целом. Мы начинаем нашу работу с чувством глубокого понимания своей ответственности перед партией и советским народом. Наша задача широко по-ленински осмыслить переживаемое время, выработать реалистическую, всесторонне взвешенную программу действий, которая органично соединила бы величие целей и реализм возможностей, планы партии с надеждами и чаяниями каждого человека. Решение 27-го съезда определят и характер, и темпы движения на годы и десятилетия вперед. Движение в качественно новому состоянию советского социалистического общества. Съезду предстоит обсудить и принять новую редакцию программы КПСС, изменения в уставе партии, основные направления развития народного хозяйства на пятилетку и перспективу. Едва ли надо говорить, сколько огромных усилий для нашей В течение ряда лет, и не только в силу объективных факторов,
Paraphrasing from William Taubman's biography of Gorbachev, there were countless differences between the two adversaries. Gorbachev was cautious and calculating, Yeltsin an impulsive risk-taker. Gorbachev worked at being even-tempered, Yeltsin either loved or hated you. Gorbachev was instinctively democratic, Yeltsin an authoritarian populist. Gorbachev was smooth, Yeltsin rough. Gorbachev a persuader, Yeltsin a brawler. Then again, there were similarities between their backgrounds too. Both came to Moscow from distant provinces, and both had families who suffered under Stalin. But for all this, there were two factors that made the greatest difference. Yeltsin could rally the support of the common people like Gorbachev never could, and Gorbachev, the builder, as powerful as his position was natural prey for Yeltsin, the disruptor. Gorbachev was outwardly complex, a long-winded speaker who could be privately emotional but strove to remain rational in politics. Yeltsin, on the other hand, always projected a stoic simplicity that people naturally gravitated toward. Gorbachev's words were above the heads of most of those who heard him speak because complex problems demand complex solutions, but Yeltsin spoke simply, as though dilemmas as convoluted as the failing economy, separatism, or foreign policy could be resolved with just a few simple steps. It was always to his advantage to seem one-dimensionally strong and resolute, but that was only ever a facade that concealed the real turmoil underneath. He struggled with alcoholism his entire life, which started as a personal issue and eventually became a national embarrassment, as he spoke drunkenly at party meetings or press conferences, drank heavily on diplomatic tours, or was too drunk to attend meetings. A series of other, darker moments also happened throughout his life. In 1987, he was hospitalized after slashing himself with scissors. In 1989, he appeared at a police station soaking wet with a bouquet of flowers and described a KGB attempt on his life before recanting his story and refusing to explain what happened. In 1992, while drunk, he attempted suicide by locking himself in a sauna. But in the late 80s, this wasn't the Yeltsin that the public knew. They saw a strong, blunt leader unafraid to attack a failing government. It was Gorbachev who first tried to undercut the old guard of reactionary communists with a wave of democratized populism and reform, but Yeltsin outflanked him to the left and rode a wave high enough to drown Gorbachev and maybe even wash away the entire communist apparatus. Now, Gorbachev's union was on the brink. Faster than even he could realize, Yeltsin's time was coming. At key moments, Yeltsin had a habit of disappearing in one way or another, absolving himself of the responsibility of making key decisions. He'd go on vacation at pivotal moments and be completely out of contact, or would get so drunk he could hardly speak. He followed a path of profound simplicity. It was easy to play the disruptor, leading the tide of resistance against the deeply flawed Gorbachev regime, but when the time came for him to make his own decisions and create his own solutions, would he have the answers? In March of 1990, Gorbachev implemented the Soviet Union's first ever nationwide elections. For the first time, the Communist Party faced real challenges from liberalizers both in the peripheral republics and in the heart of Russia. Yeltsin was elected as the chair of the Supreme Soviet of Russia, making him perhaps the second most powerful man in the entire USSR. Elsewhere, in the republics, elections showed mass support for independence from the Soviet Union. Independence parties made major gains in Ukraine and Belarus, and the Supreme Soviets of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia all declared independence. In the following months, Yeltsin made a stunning move.
Как глава высшей законодательной власти республики, я должен подчиняться воле народа и его полномочных представителей. Поэтому я в соответствии со своими обязательствами, данными в предвыборный период, заявляю о своем выходе из КПСС, чтобы иметь большую возможность эффективно влиять на деятельность Советов, готов сотрудничать со всеми партиями и общественно-политическими организациями республики.
Gorbachev, fresh off winning a Nobel Peace Prize, faced increasing pressure from hardline communists to crack down on democratic reformers and Republican separatists to save the Union. He's internationally lauded as a man of peace for withdrawing Soviet troops from Eastern Europe and allowing the reunification of Germany, but the reactionary Soviets hated seeing the weakening of their imperial status. This is the moment where Gorbachev had to choose which path to go down. turn his back on the liberalization movement, follow the path of his predecessors and violently strike down the uprising to save the Union at a massive blood price, or stand by and let the USSR split and collapse. Once again, he tried to walk the middle path, but in time it becomes apparent that such a path does not exist. In January of 1991, he authorized moving Soviet troops into the Baltic states to prevent their exit from the Union. For nearly half a century, the Balts had been under the thumb of Soviet oppression, and during 5 years of glasnost, they'd openly clamored for independence. Nationalist fervor was at an all-time high, and rather than squashing the movement, the presence of Soviet troops only made them more defiant. Yeltsin aligned with the leaders of the Baltic states, aiming to sap away more of Gorbachev's authority. On January 11th, Gorbachev announced that there would be no further use of force in the Baltics, but only hours later, it became horrifyingly clear the lack of control he had over his own military.
The deadly crackdown brought forth images of Beijing's Tiananmen or Prague 68 in its swiftness and disregard for civilian lives. Tank-led paratroopers struck at both the capital's transmission tower and broadcast center. Tanks crushed cars like flimsy toys. We saw one driver dead, trapped inside. Soldiers used nightsticks, smoke bombs, and at last, live ammunition. Several thousand unarmed Lithuanians had camped out at the installations in the belief that Moscow would not take the political risk of killing or wounding unarmed civilians. They were wrong. At its end, at least 13 lie dead, hundreds wounded. With daybreak Sunday, attention shifted to the Parliament building. Thousands of people gathered, many in shock and disbelief. Inside, the democratically elected government of President Landsbergis tried to carry on. Landsbergis called on the world to pay attention. At midday, a delegation from Moscow arrived. It was this delegation, encouraged by Gorbachev, that gave Lithuanians here a false sense of security and hoped the Kremlin would not force them to abandon their independence struggle. But it seemed clear the time for delegations had passed. Moscow seemed prepared to put into place an army-backed so-called Committee for National Salvation as a new government.
Just last night, at a meeting of the Kremlin's Federation Council, the Soviet leader said no further force would be used against Lithuania while a commission went to investigate. Hours later, Soviet troops attacked. Today, Gorbachev's silence has been deafening.
In the wake of the violence, hardliners urged Gorbachev to seize greater powers to rein in the stray republics, but he refused. Aside from his own objection to bloodshed, Gorbachev knew that with spiraling public support and a group of reactionary bureaucrats coalescing against him, the last reliable source of political legitimacy he had was his international reputation. Leaders like Francois Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl, John Major, and especially George Bush still saw Gorbachev as an ally, but the use of mass force against a civilian uprising would leave him completely stranded. The bloodshed in the Baltic ceased there, but it was still another defeat for Gorbachev. He lost face internationally, the hardliners saw his weakness, and Republican separatists gained more momentum. After the violence in the Baltic states, it was clear that the Soviet Union could not continue to exist in its current form. Domestic reforms were flopping, the people were suffering, and the republics were drifting farther away every day. Gorbachev pushed for reform that would loosen the sovereignty of the federal government to appease the republics while still maintaining a cohesive state, but Yeltsin's focus was on empowering the Russian government and himself as much as possible. He even went on live television and demanded that Gorbachev resign. It was a clear moment of the divide between the public and the legislators, because while many Soviet citizens agreed, Russian politicians were shocked that Yeltsin would say such a caustic and potentially destructive thing on national television. Now both Gorbachev and Yeltsin found themselves at the brink. The maverick had gone too far, and the walls of the Russian parliament might have just caved in on him. Yeltsin's problem is that while he has the supporters, especially in major Russian cities, the structure of the Russian bureaucracy is only skeletal and hardly functional, in comparison to Gorbachev's more robust KGB and Soviet apparatus. To empower himself any further, Yeltsin needs to win a national referendum in Russia, but he doesn't have the funds to pay for that kind of nationwide initiative. This is where Gorbachev steps on a rake. Still in control of the purse strings, he funds a massive union-wide referendum on the reformation of the Soviet Union in an attempt to liberalize the nation and appease Republican dissidents. But all over the Soviet Union, from Ukraine to Kazakhstan, republics tack on their own amendments on sovereignty and independence. Paradoxically, the public seems to support both sides. Gorbachev wins a referendum on his Union Treaty, suggesting the public desire to keep the USSR alive, but republics like Ukraine and Belarus pass referendums on sovereignty, and most importantly, Russia creates a powerful new executive office, the presidency. For the first time since 1917, the Russian masses look to be on the brink of tearing down their own empire. Gorbachev, facing the imminent collapse of his global superpower, prepared for one final push to save the state. In the elections for the Russian presidency in June 1991, Yeltsin won easily. There were now two presidents in the Kremlin. One, the waning face of an empire in decline, the other, a democratically elected leader of a nation being reborn. In the wake of Yeltsin's election, most of the Soviet Union's populace still supported a unified state, but in urban centers like Moscow, Gorbachev feared mass demonstrations in favor of Russian independence. At this point, Yeltsin's aim was to redistribute power in the Soviet Union to the republics rather than destroy it entirely, but plenty of Muscovites wanted Gorbachev and the entire communist apparatus completely gone. In late March 91, fearing a populist surge, Gorbachev banned public demonstrations and rallies in the city for 3 weeks. Supporters of democratic Russia feared that the Soviet army would flood the city, the Russian parliament would strip Yeltsin of his presidency, and Gorbachev would seize emergency powers. In the battle between the two presidents, Gorbachev had supreme authority and a whole lot of guns, but Yeltsin had the people. The Russian parliament convened on March 28th to determine the question of Yeltsin's presidency and Russian national sovereignty. 40,000 Red Army troops were stationed outside, and the Russian parliamentarians were furious. Instead of removing Yeltsin for defying Gorbachev, they aligned with him in opposition to the show of force. Throughout the city, hundreds of thousands of Russians defied the ban on demonstrations. Once again, Gorbachev was left with the choice to either stand down or spill blood on the streets of the capital. Nobody, especially not Gorbachev, was willing to use mass violence, so before things got any worse, he withdrew the troops from Moscow. The protesters were elated, and Yeltsin had won a massive victory. For all the levers of power available to Gorbachev, none could outweigh a mass popular demonstration. The factor still playing into Gorbachev's favor was his international status. In the early 90s, he was a global celebrity and a friend of Western leaders, and the Soviet Union was so utterly dependent on foreign credit that even Yeltsin recognized his dependence on Gorbachev's reputation. And though Yeltsin made strides to gain international status, he still had a habit of embarrassing himself on foreign visits. Gorbachev knew that the days of an ultra-powerful federal center to the Union were over, so he envisioned a new state, a federation of sovereign republics with a diminished but still powerful federal government, naturally with himself at the very top. He brought the leaders of the republics to the table to negotiate a new constitution, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the personal rivalry between the two presidents was a major obstacle to progress. It was a zero-sum game, and Yeltsin knew that the more progress Gorbachev made in any initiative, the harder it would be to dislodge him from power. On top of this, it seemed that Yeltsin didn't know what he should do. Would it be in the interest of Russia and of himself to remain in a union, or should they go it alone? In late spring of 1991, in spite of Yeltsin's uncooperativeness, Gorbachev successfully negotiated a new Union treaty with the leaders of the republics that would transform the Soviet Union into a confederation of sovereign republics. Several republics were gone for good, but 9 major Soviet republics participated in the negotiations, and all but Ukraine agreed to the terms. Key legislative bodies in the Soviet Union would be dissolved, hardline conservatives would be dismissed, and Gorbachev would remain president. The date for finalizing and signing the treaty was set as August 19, 1991. For all the chaos of the last 2 years, it seemed that Gorbachev had made the necessary concessions for his regime to survive, albeit in a different form. The Soviet Union would be radically reformed, but it would remain. In the days leading up to the ratification of the treaty, exhausted and confident of his coming victory, Gorbachev went on vacation to his dacha in Crimea. Remembering how Khrushchev had been deposed by Brezhnev while on vacation 3 decades earlier, some of his liberal allies advised him to stay in Moscow until the deal was finalized, but Gorbachev was completely confident in his position and had no fear of plotters moving against him. Shadowy actors had been convening in secret for the past year, powerful figures who believed that Gorbachev's reforms were destroying the union they devoted their lives to. His key allies Alexander Yakovlev and Edward Shevardnadze warned him of the threat of a reactionary coup that would install a dictator who'd be willing to use force to keep the union intact, but Gorbachev didn't listen. Behind his back, KGB chief Khrushchev, Prime Minister Pavlov, Interior Minister Pugo, and others agreed that action must be taken before the Union Treaty could be signed. Even some of Gorbachev's most trusted allies became complicit. Vice President Yanayev, Gorbachev's immediate successor, and Chairman Lukyanov, a friend of Gorbachev since law school, who held the authority to convene the legislature, could have killed the plot at any moment, but they didn't. On August 18, 1991, the day before the Union Treaty would be signed, the coup began. At 4:32 p.m., the phone lines were cut. Minutes later, Gorbachev's complicit KGB security allowed the leaders of the plot inside, and they demanded that Gorbachev either resign or declare a national state of emergency. They expected him to cooperate, but he furiously refused, and they left feeling anxious and dejected. Gorbachev was now under house arrest, imprisoned by his own KGB guards with no line of contact to the outside world. The plotters flew back to Moscow without a clear idea of what to do next. They met with Vice President Yanayev, who was reluctant to act. Cooperating with the coup would make him its leader, the next president of the Soviet Union, but if it failed, the consequences would crush him. If he refused and sat on the sidelines, whether the coup succeeded or failed, he'd probably be irrelevant or worse. If he sided with Gorbachev and tried to fight the plotters, he'd probably just be arrested too. Ultimately, Yanayev was just a gray, unimaginative party loyalist who embodied the worst traits of the latter-day Politburo. He nervously decided to accept power, and in the early hours of the 19th, he signed an emergency decree entrusting himself with the presidency. 250,000 pairs of handcuffs were ordered, and the Lefortovo prison in Moscow was emptied in preparation for a massive influx of political prisoners. At 6 a.m., it was broadcasted that Gorbachev was ill and Yanayev was taking power, and a state of emergency was declared. The free press was shut down. Several of the plotters themselves were in such states of panic that they needed to be hospitalized. Only Marshal Yazov was decisive and clear-headed, ordering troops into Moscow to secure the seat of power. Members of the KGB's Alpha Squadron were ordered to arrest Yeltsin at his dacha near Moscow. They surrounded the home, but for unclear reasons, they never moved in to arrest him. Yeltsin began convening an emergency government in his dacha, and around 9 a.m. on the 19th, they relocated to the Russian Parliament building. Alongside prominent Russian officials, Yeltsin issued a statement denouncing the coup. The public waited, uncertain of what outcome lay in store. On one hand, Gorbachev was still the face of the nation, who held legitimate authority of the state. On the other, he'd long been indecisive and lacking in real strength, so maybe they'd be better off with a new figure at the helm who can implement real change. Yeltsin was the greatest unknown in the equation. For whatever reason, the coup had failed to detain him, but what stance would he take, and what resistance would he be able to muster? Yeltsin, still free, feared imprisonment, but back in Crimea, a detained Gorbachev feared assassination. He and his family refused to eat or drink what was given to them to prevent a poisoning, and he secretly recorded and smuggled the tape out of the dacha to prove that he was in good health, and that the action taken by the emergency committee and others was nothing short of a coup. Ironically, Gorbachev was now utterly dependent on his greatest rival. He could do nothing to free himself, and only Boris Yeltsin had the popular authority to mount a genuine resistance to the coup. The military sat on the fence, waiting to see who'd be in power when everything settled. The KGB's loyalty was split between their chief, Khrushchev, and their president, Gorbachev. Key figures who remained loyal to Gorbachev and opposed the dictatorial coup like Shevardnadze and Yakovlev had largely fallen out of Gorbachev's favor, and those who Gorbachev had empowered and trusted the most were the ones who betrayed him. Only Yeltsin, his one overt adversary, had the power and the motive to act in his defense and save him from the coup. They may have never liked each other personally, and their politics were undeniably at odds, but at least Yeltsin knew that in Gorbachev's union he never had to fear political persecution or despotism. There was no telling what might become of Yeltsin if the reactionary coup settled into lasting power. He had no choice but to marshal his resources against the emergency committee. In this situation, Gorbachev said, "I can count on Yeltsin." Workers across Russia went on strike in opposition to the coup, and the citizens of Moscow erected barriers around the Russian parliament to prevent a military takeover. Acting President Yanayev gave a press conference late in the afternoon on the 19th, but his hands shook and his speech wavered. In this fragile environment, the ability to project power was everything, and while Yanayev trembled on television, Yeltsin took bold action. He met the masses rallied outside of the Russian parliament, and in the most important moment of his life, he mounted a Soviet tank and delivered a speech that denounced the coup and demanded the return of Gorbachev to the presidency. He appealed to the Red Army soldiers to disobey orders, with some tank battalions defecting to Yeltsin's side, but many remained on the fence. Civilians massed around the Russian parliament brought food and water to the tank crews, urging them not to attack their own friends and family members in the crowd, but when Yanayev's commandant ordered a curfew for the night of August 20th, mass bloodshed seemed imminent. The 50,000 civilians surrounding the parliament, determined to protect Yeltsin's democratic government from the emergency committee, did not disperse. On the afternoon of the 20th, Khrushchev, Pugo, and Yazov decided that it was time to attack. Tanks, helicopters, paratroopers, and special forces were marshaled for the attack, preparing to seize the building and arrest or kill the parliamentarians at 2 a.m. on August 21st. The Muscovite civilians blockaded the streets in any way they could, and when the tanks and armored infantry began moving in at midnight, they covered the vehicles' observation slits and even lit them on fire. The first shots rang out and 3 civilians were killed. The world awaited the announcement that Yeltsin's been killed and the Russian parliament crushed. The parliamentarians braced themselves for special forces to seize the building and arrest or kill them at any moment. But nobody in the assembled armed forces wanted to be the one to issue the final order. Neither the KGB forces, the army, nor the riot police were willing to be the ones to launch a civilian slaughter. So they waited. As time passed, more and more units defected to the flag of Russia and Yeltsin. Finally, Marshal Yazov ordered the troops to withdraw. In the end, not even the most die-hard communists were willing to inflict massive bloodshed because they knew that the Soviet Union was only a carcass, just a husk of what had once been a global superpower. The coup never really made sense. The USSR was utterly dependent on Western credits and food, and they'd be immediately cut off if Gorbachev was illegally deposed. There was no strong leader in the bureaucracy or the military who could rise up and legitimately challenge Gorbachev or Yeltsin. Less than a sinister and cunning junta, it was just the last act of desperate old communists who wouldn't let their empire die without a fight. Now, they had to admit that it was over. They abandoned the Kremlin and boarded a flight to Crimea to go see Gorbachev. The leaders of the coup departed to go see Gorbachev, but nobody knew what their intent was. Would they try and seize him and flee to create an opposition government somewhere else? Yeltsin dispatched a party to race after them and try to get to Gorbachev first, but the plotters were hours ahead. When the emergency committee arrived, though, it was obvious that they were beaten and they had no intent to try anything. Gorbachev's communications were restored, and he immediately called Boris Yeltsin. "Mikhail Sergeyevich," Yeltsin said, "so you're alive. We've been fighting for you for the last 48 hours. Gorbachev refused to speak to any of the plotters except one, Chairman Lukyanov, his old friend who'd betrayed him. Lukyanov tried to defend himself, but Gorbachev knew that he could have ended the coup at any time, and he didn't, Gorbachev thought, because he wanted power for himself. Lukyanov was arrested, and finally, Yeltsin's delegation, led by his vice president Alexander Rutskoy, joyfully greeted Gorbachev's party and brought them back to Moscow. Gorbachev was restored to power, and the entire emergency committee was arrested, except for Minister Pugo, who committed suicide. The national nightmare was over, but in only a few days, power had been seismically upended and redistributed away from the Gorbachev government and the entire communist apparatus towards Yeltsin's democratically elected Russian government. In the end, it was mass resistance to the coup in major cities that doomed the emergency committee. Moscow rallied around Yeltsin, and in Leningrad, Mayor Anatoly Sobchak organized resistance to the coup with key aid from a KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. In the wake of the coup, Moscow was in a pro-Russian fever, and Yeltsin rode higher than ever before. In the heat of emergency, Yeltsin seized new powers, taking control of the Red Army on Russian territory to challenge the coup's claim to the military. He also appropriated Soviet news and other centrally controlled industry within Russia for the Russian government, expecting Gorbachev to recognize the inevitable and cede those powers to him. Gorbachev refused, replaced the traitors from his government with new appointees, and got right back on track trying to push the Union Treaty through. He believed that though there were some bad actors in the Communist Party, it could still be a tool for positive change. Yeltsin and most Soviets thought differently. In an emergency session of the Russian parliament on August 24th, just a few days after the coup, Yeltsin leveraged public outrage to force Gorbachev to sign a document suspending the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on live television. It was an especially nasty moment, attacking the weakened Gorbachev only a few dozen hours after saving him. Evidently, Yeltsin felt guilty because afterward he took Gorbachev to his office and made a sincere offer for their families to go on vacation together, hoping to convert the fading Gorbachev from an obstacle to a friend. Gorbachev awkwardly refused, and after that, neither ever made an attempt to become allies again. By September, Yeltsin had essentially assumed most of the power that Gorbachev once held. There wasn't a legal framework to support it, but Gorbachev had neither the power nor the popular support to resist it. He tried to hold on to some authority by cobbling together an international coalition, but the Union was falling away fast. First the Baltic states, then Ukraine, then Belarus. One by one, the republics declared their sovereignty and shirked off the fading Union. Gorbachev's only potential play was banking on his international reputation to obtain a massive Marshall Plan-like investment of tens of billions of dollars to completely transform the economy. But in the wake of the coup, his government looked so fragile that the international community would never go for something so drastic, and he probably knew it. As much as Yeltsin wanted to put Gorbachev entirely in the rear view, he still needed him. Most of the leaders of the republics resented Gorbachev, but he was the devil they knew, and no matter what would become of the Soviet Union, those nations were fundamentally interdependent and needed to find ways to work together. Gorbachev had the international clout needed to facilitate negotiations on the key issues. Nations like Russia, Ukraine, and Georgia may have wanted independence from one another, but they recognized the critical reality that there was no Russian economy, no Ukrainian economy, no Georgian economy, only a single Soviet economy which bound all of them together. Russian cities depended on coal from the Donbas region of Ukraine, which depended on timber from the Baltic states to build mine shafts, which depended on oil from Siberian oil fields, and so on. And critically, these nations needed to resolve the potentially disastrous disagreements on borders, military control, and ownership of nuclear weapons. Day by day, Gorbachev's vision of a strong federation with himself at the helm was fading. On September 5th, the Congress of People's Deputies, a massive legislature that he created years earlier to try and democratize the USSR, was formally dissolved. Whatever federal authority still existed belonged to the State Council of Executive Heads of the Republic, with Gorbachev impotently struggling to shepherd them into a renewed union. In the months following the coup, none of the republics had any faith in the communist apparatus, but an increasingly lonely Gorbachev refused to abandon the ship. But if Gorbachev didn't know what to do, neither did Yeltsin. Facing the reality that he was the individual most directly responsible for the end of the Soviet Union, an empire which he'd spent 60 years of his life loyally serving, the pressure on him was massive. He sought the guidance of key economists to tell him how to navigate the transition, but it wasn't enough. And on September 16th, feeling the weight of history upon him, he cracked and vanished, disappearing on vacation and going completely out of contact to absolve himself of the need to make any of the history-defining decisions that lay before him. After days of absence, Gorbachev finally called him and implored him to come back. He needed to take responsibility for the mess he created and choose a decisive economic course of action. Lacking a clear understanding of the complex economic landscape, Yeltsin looked to the most confident voice he could find, a young economist named Yegor Gaidar. Gaidar argued that the necessary transition to a market economy would inevitably cause great pain and suffering, and that it must be done immediately, like ripping a band-aid off, rather than prolonging the transformation. Simultaneously privatizing the economy, removing the social safety net, and freeing price controls all across the Union, the entire Russosphere would be dunked into ice water overnight. He acknowledged that the people would suffer, and Yeltsin would become unpopular, but that's why he had to do it quickly. Don't do it gradually and give the people a chance to realize how bad things would get, because then they might change their mind and rise up against you. Shock therapy. Do it all in one go, get it over with, and in a year or two, the market would begin to bloom. Plenty of other advisors urged Yeltsin to go a more gentle and gradual path, but he gravitated towards Gaidar's decisiveness and accepted his plan. Unbeknownst to Gorbachev, in early December 1991, Yeltsin summoned his economic counselors and the leaders of Belarus and Ukraine to a hunting lodge in Belovezhskaya, a forest in West Belarus, to devise their own post-Soviet accords. In a referendum a week earlier, 91% of Ukrainians had backed complete independence, effectively ending any hope for a renewed union. Yeltsin, along with Ukrainian President Kravchuk and Belarusian President Shushkevich, huddled together to determine the future of the post-Soviet sphere. It was a tense, nervous atmosphere as the men hunted in the forest together and returned to drink heavily and negotiate how their nations could be divorced. None of them relished their historical roles in the destruction of their empire, and they even feared that the KGB might swoop in and arrest all of them, were Gorbachev to catch wind of their gathering and decide to ignite a potentially catastrophic clash between old and new power structures. In the frenetic atmosphere, somebody threw out a suggestion. Here and now, let's formally dissolve the Soviet Union and finally shut the door on Gorbachev's efforts to stitch the republics together. And so they did. Gorbachev must be removed, Yeltsin said. Enough, no more playing the Tsar. Signed December 8th, 1991, it was declared. The USSR, as a subject of international law and geopolitical reality, is ceasing its existence. Yeltsin promised to drink a glass of champagne to toast each of the 14 articles in the agreement, and by the end, he was too drunk to speak. Gorbachev tried to intervene, but it was too late. The Belovezh Accords became internationally recognized, a decree establishing the separate statehoods of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Without the Slavic core of the empire, there was no USSR to save anymore. In his memoirs, Gorbachev wrote, "What they so hastily and stealthily did in Belovezh was like a plot to kill an injured but still living person by dismembering it." But nobody was listening to Gorbachev anymore. 2 weeks later, the triumvirate met with the presidents of the rest of the republics at Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan, where 11 of the 15 former Soviet republics signed a treaty establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States, a loose treaty suggesting the military, political, and economic cooperation between the republics, with Russia becoming the ultimate successor state to the Soviet Union, inheriting its UN Security Council seat, $70 billion in debt, and other Soviet responsibilities. Ultimately, though, in the frenzied final months of the USSR, many critical questions were left with inadequate answers. The fate of the USSR's nuclear arsenal, spread across Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, loomed large in the minds of those who feared violent conflict over questions like the ownership of Crimea and Donbass, disputed between Russia and Ukraine. Now, Gorbachev sat alone in his office, a Tsar with no empire. Yeltsin came to see him in the final days to establish the terms of his retirement. President Bush called and made Yeltsin promise never to prosecute his friend Mikhail, but beyond that, Gorbachev and Yeltsin could hardly stand to speak to each other. Alexander Yakovlev, Gorbachev's old friend, was brought in to mediate, and they agreed that Gorbachev would refrain from criticism in his retirement, and in exchange, he'd retain his country house, dozens of servants and guards, and receive premises in Moscow to begin the Gorbachev Foundation. After the meeting, Yakovlev found Gorbachev alone in his back office, reclining with tears in his eyes. "This is how it ends, Sasha," he said. The reformer, who embarked on a quest to transform the Soviet Union 6 years earlier, was at the end of his journey. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev formally dissolved the Soviet Union and made his resignation speech on live television. He acknowledged no fault on his own part for the collapse, blaming everyone else for the geopolitical catastrophe that ruptured the ground under his feet on his watch. To the American news team broadcasting the event, it was a stunning moment, the end of a huge chapter of history. They were surprised to observe that, in Russia, nobody seemed to care. When 1992 dawned, Boris Yeltsin was the man of the hour. The Russian people were already suffering amidst a famine and economic despair, and shock therapy hadn't even kicked in yet. They were all in for an awful decade, but in that moment, before all the ensuing tragedies, Yeltsin held his head high. Then, on January 2nd, shock therapy began. The republics finalized their divorce, many state institutions were privatized, and price controls vanished almost overnight. Imagine you're a citizen of the Soviet Union. You work for a state-owned enterprise, you live in publicly subsidized housing, and there's a social safety net in place. Things are deeply flawed, conditions aren't very good, but you aren't in abject poverty. Then, in 1992, it all rapidly disappears. Inflation skyrockets, making individual savings irrelevant. Privatized industries are gobbled up by a handful of oligarchs. There's little or no welfare available. Your subsidized housing is gone. Things were bad in the last days of the Soviet Union, but they were much, much worse in the early days of Russia. In the 1980s, about 30% of Russians lived in poverty. In the 1990s, that number skyrocketed to 70 or 80%. Between 1988 and 1998, Russian life expectancy dropped by 4 years. It didn't take long for the suffering inflicted by Yeltsin's radical economic reforms to coalesce into an opposition. The Russian parliament, which had been elected in the dying years of the USSR, quickly turned on the nation's first president. Alexander Rutskoy, Yeltsin's vice president, and Ruslan Khasbulatov, the parliament's first speaker, aligned in opposition to Yeltsin, but after surviving an impeachment vote and winning a vote of confidence in a national referendum, the president felt empowered to take extreme action. On September 21, 1993, he declared that the parliament was dissolved. When they resisted his decrees, Yeltsin shut off power and water to the parliament building. Ironically paralleling Yeltsin's own stand outside the parliament 2 years earlier, thousands of Russians rallied in Moscow to oppose the president. Yeltsin declared a national state of emergency, fearing that a civil war might erupt. Rutskoy urged the pro-parliament crowd to take the Ostankino broadcast tower that broadcasted Russian state news. The pro-parliament crowd, which included paramilitary forces, launched an assault on the Russian National Guard and police forces defending the station. An unknown number of people died in the clash, including several Western journalists. Snipers picked targets from the crowd at random, including civilians rendering medical assistance. In the wake of the conflict, after long debate, the army sided with Yeltsin, and the parliament's hopes were doomed. At dawn, on October 4th, the Russian army surrounded the parliament and began shelling. From inside, Rutskoy, the old Air Force hero, urged the Russian Air Force to bomb the Kremlin, but his calls went unanswered. Russian troops stormed the parliament, and by late afternoon, the conflict was over. Rutskoy, Khasbulatov, and other leaders of the parliament were imprisoned, and Yeltsin consolidated power. At the end of 1993, Yeltsin pushed through a new constitution that's still in effect in Russia today, which greatly empowers the president with a comparatively weak parliament. However, elections in December strongly favored the political opponents of Yeltsin's neoliberal economic reforms, showing that while Yeltsin was now an authoritarian president, he and his policies were increasingly unpopular. In the post-Soviet space, plenty of ethnic regions chafed for independence from Russia. In 1994, aiming to crush Chechen separatism, Yeltsin ordered an invasion. It was unpopular with the public and within the military, and it quickly spiraled into disaster. Chechen militias proved devastatingly effective within their homeland, and after tens of thousands of deaths, the Russians withdrew and signed a peace treaty in 1997, before launching another disastrous war only 2 years later. Gorbachev had been unpopular at the end, but he'd always been austere, the dignified face of a global superpower. Yeltsin, in comparison, was often the butt of the joke, just the biggest clown at the Russian rodeo. Once, in 1995, he came to Washington and got so drunk that he was found on Pennsylvania Avenue in the middle of the night in his underwear, looking for pizza. Another time, he visited Dublin for diplomacy, but he never even got off the plane. His health was always in question, and he secretly had several heart attacks while in office. His approval rating quickly dropped into single digits. Gorbachev's legacy was diminished too. He was widely disliked in Russia, getting most of the blame for the fall of the USSR, and when the money from the book deals and speaking engagements fell short of what he needed for his foundation, the former Tsar of the Soviet Empire was reduced to doing commercials for Pizza Hut. Throughout the 90s, foreign powers brought in as much as $40 billion in aid to the fledgling Russian Federation, but most of that desperately needed boost seems to have vanished into foreign bank accounts. It was a sorry time for Russia. The empire was gone, the economy had crashed, crime and conflict were widespread, and leadership was corrupt. Western powers puppeted Yeltsin's government to make it favorable to their interests, and foreign businesses swooped in to get rich off Russian assets. And at the helm was this big, ailing, drunken bear who lacked the energy and discipline needed to fix anything. On December 31st, 1999, Yeltsin went on television to address the people with an unexpected announcement. Dear Russians, a very short time remains before a magical date in our history, a new century, a new millennium. Dear friends, my dear ones, today I am turning to you for the last time with New Year's greetings. But that's not all. Today I am turning to you for the last time as President of Russia. I have made a decision. Today, on the last day of the departing century, I am resigning. I want to say just a few more personal words than usual. I want to ask your forgiveness for the fact that many of the dreams we shared did not come true, and for the fact that what seemed simple to us turned out to be tormentingly difficult. I turned out to be too naive. I am leaving. I did all I could. A new generation is relieving me, a generation of those who can do more and better. As I resign, I have signed a decree placing the duties of the President of Russia on the head of the government, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Bidding farewell, I want to tell each of you, be happy. You deserve happiness. Happy New Year, happy new century, my dear ones. Yeltsin quickly faded away. Putin, who'd been a key advisor to Yeltsin for several years and the Russian Prime Minister for the last several months, was relatively unknown, but he was serious and dignified and sober, and the new strongman quickly won over the trust of the Russian people. His approval ratings in Russia have remained strong throughout 2 decades of his reign. According to an old Soviet joke, Gorbachev and Yeltsin would only be reconciled the day they met in prison. Both of them escaped that fate, and they never made peace. Anatoly Chernyayev, Gorbachev's close friend and advisor, wrote that Gorbachev created Yeltsin to be used like a bulldozer to clear the road for his ideas, countering stubborn obstacles like Yegor Ligachev. But when those obstacles were conquered, the bulldozer ran wild and eventually turned on him. In his endeavor to save the Soviet Union, Gorbachev unleashed forces he could never control. Many question how history would have unfolded without Gorbachev, if, say, Yuri Andropov lived 10 years longer. Maybe the USSR would have survived, making more conservative reforms and gently easing into the market, or maybe it would have collapsed into a bloody civil war. Gorbachev and Yeltsin always blamed one another for the collapse of the Soviet Union, but in Russia today, Gorbachev generally gets the blame. Outside of Russia, Gorbachev gets credit for his idealism and his commitment to the peaceful transition out of Eastern Europe, but in his homeland, his weakness and indecision is viewed as the primary cause of the collapse of the empire. Had Gorbachev and Yeltsin been able to overcome their personal rivalry and work together on serious economic reforms and liberalization, things could have been different, but they never did and they never were. To no small extent, the course of history was determined by the inability of these two men to ever get along. Gorbachev dreamt of a humanitarian socialism that fulfilled the grand aspirations of Lenin. Yeltsin put his trust in liberal democracy in the market. In the end, both were failed by and failures of their visions of the future. Boris Yeltsin died at age 76 in 2007. Gorbachev passed away in 2022 at the age of 91. The world is left to grapple with the historical consequences of the deficiencies in both of the masters of Russian history.